going to hand over to you, Gary. Thank you very much for coming along. If once Gary's spoken, please stick around, and Gary's going to answer all your questions, I guess, in the time that remains. We kick out at 7, so that'll be when we kick out. But anyway, I'll hand you over to Gary. Thank you, Gary, for coming along, and we'll catch up in a bit.
Thanks, Glenn. Appreciate that. So hopefully there's a couple of slides sharing right now. If I've got that right, if I haven't, please jump into the chat or let me know that's not happening. So just to move this along, quick, just a bit about me and the company. Uleska is a Belfast-based company. We build platforms and consulting, etc., and around tooling, security tooling inside CI/CD, making all that DevSecOps stuff work. But we're not here to talk too much about the product. It is more about the culture and how all these things work together. So a bit about myself. So I started off in the 90s as a programmer. I was actually some form or title of software developer for 15 years before moving into the world of security. So I worked in telecoms, I worked in TV industry as well, and then moved to be a security architect over at Citigroup. And in that time, spent cycles or jobs in and around development, operations and security. Although I never actually had an operations title, so that's part of the sort of thing we'll bring up here. What I would like, and what you mentioned there, Glenn, about interrupting and about people jumping in. I have a number of slides we can go through here. To me, success is us coming out with good information and debate on this. So if we end up on the first slide and then having a full 30-minute debate, that's absolutely fine for me. So anybody jumping in with questions or wants to come on stage at any time, please do so. Some of the information I'm going to present is horribly generic, horribly, how general development or security or operations team is going to have it's going to work. And where it comes from is my own experiences working in these different departments inside software organizations for large and small companies. Also running a company that works inside software development as well and security. But also all the different conferences you go to, all the different things I've done. One thing I didn't mention was in terms of security, I've worked a lot with an organization called OWASP, which is the Open Web Application Security Project. I was a board member for it for a number of years. I rolled off last year. I've ran conferences, chapters. I've led the secure coding guidelines project. So we've done a lot of work with them as well and talked to a lot of people over the years about what works in terms of security and not. I do remember in America, one guy doing a presentation at a security conference, and he said he had a special skill, which was he was able to program. He was a developer, and it was the first time I'd ever heard that the fact that most people in security haven't come from a development background, which was my experience. Again, happy to chat and debate about that. So as far as I'm concerned, what we could see, if anybody wants to jump in, absolutely jump in and have a conversation. That's really going to be good. There is a chat window here. I got to say, it is a bit small on my screen, so apologies if I don't get to see that all the time. It's just on my separate screen, so that might be hard for me to see. So what are we going to cover? We're going to talk generically about the developers, about the operations people, and about the security people. And it's going to come from a really high level point of view of who are these people, what's their aims, what gets them up in the morning, what makes them like working with operations, and what makes them like working with security, or the other way around. And also part of this, like obviously I work in a cybersecurity company. We've done lots of interactions, both in conferences, sales calls, customer discovery, all that sort of stuff, where you're talking to lots of different interesting companies that have, there's never the same culture or setup running twice. So that really makes it interesting to see some of the anti-patterns and patterns that come up, and that helps drive into how do we see sometimes the DevSecOps work or not work in various organizations. So we will cover a lot of profiles. We'll talk about some of the problems that comes up. And again, we're not going to try and prescribe too many solutions. So talking about the developers, the dev in terms of DevSecOps, if we were to take a generic developer and describe their job, it is all about programming and identifying code solutions for customer problems. You know, that it's interesting whenever we talk to coders, and there's been research in around this here, it's around about 30 to 40% of their time is actually spent writing code. A lot of the other times is, you know, debugging stuff or trying to work out how some platform works or that sort of thing. But their main job, the reason why they're in a company, is to produce software and coding solutions that solve some internal stakeholder or some sort of customer problems. You know, what skills do they have? Well, a developer, if they're going for a job, or if you look at the many job specs out there that are trying to attract developers, you know, they deal in languages. So you've got C++ developers, you've got C# developers, you've got Java. It's usually aligned pretty much with the languages, and normally in terms of their ability to, you know, code and put solutions in, they'd also have the ability to do things on cloud and infrastructure. They know how to examine code, how to do code reviews, how to work in agile environments, all that sort of stuff. And that's really the main thing when, if you're a junior developer moving up, that's the skills you're going to work on and learn before you start branching out into other areas of development that we'll get into. So whenever they're around the water cooler or around the bar or whatever place they're doing their sociability, what impresses other developers whenever you're having those conversations? Well, usually for a developer, that's going to be in and around the specifics of the code. So I know whenever I was a developer and you were trying to do promotions, the skills that they would be asking you to have would be more specifics on a language, maybe more design patterns, that sort of thing. Maybe the ability to, you know, create code that's going to pass more code reviews, or your peers or superiors, whenever they are code reviewing your software pulls, etc., that they say, right, well, this makes sense, or that's good quality, etc. So this is really interesting. That's where they focus. Now, we haven't talked at all about security. This is really what the developers do, and that's one of the things that we have to be mindful of, is that the developers, especially when they're going through university, etc., don't have security. That's one of their aspects. What they deal in is, can they create code? Can they have it look good? Can they understand the platforms and the languages they're using, the compilers, etc., and can they get that running probably on some cloud box, or back in my day it was on you know, Linux boxes, or even Unix boxes back in the 90s. As I mentioned, in terms of job progression, getting up the ranks is usually about your skills as a programmer. Now, as you get to a certain level, and again, happy for anybody to jump in with the debate in this here, it's usually about then going into some other of the specialities. You know, can you get more into performance or scalability program? I mean, can you get to a point where you know more about how this language is going to work on a certain device or a certain CPU, etc.? There are specifics in security, and I've got to say that's the route I went down. And for most of us here who are at a DevSecOps session, probably security is somewhere in our mind that we've thought, well, either we've come from programming or we've come from a security aspect or whatever that may be, and security's been there. Now, at this same time, somewhere else on the internet or somewhere else in London or around the world, there are sessions on the specific with Java or on Linux or on other specialities, performance, scalability, as I mentioned. So we are always in this sort of environment, and what I've found in our, you know, echo chamber is you always obviously see more about the security angle, but a lot of the programmers will not get anywhere near security. In fact, I remember I've been in companies that were a couple of hundred developers, of which none were interested in security, and not even saw that as an annoyance. There was no penetration tests going on. There was no checks being done from a security point of view. It just wasn't even part of the conversation. Performance, absolutely. How does the code work and be efficient? Can we make it faster? Absolutely. Security, just not. There wasn't any role inside the company that dealt with security. So one thing it's interesting for us to understand is, when people are moving up the ranks into as a developer, they're either going to get more technical into being an architect or some speciality, or they're going to move into management. So whenever we're in development, or sorry, security programs or DevSecOps, bringing more education and bringing more knowledge to security people, we have to be aware that that's something they will do, and people are interested in it, but they're not going to see that as a priority for themselves in terms of moving up the ranks. It's just not something that, in my experience and in lots of conversations, that promotions depend on. So it's just something for us to keep in mind. Security is never going to be their main driver, at least as a general rule. So let's staying with the developers. Let's look at their relationships and what they work with. So stay on the operations. Developers pretty much have a better understanding of operations than they have of security. Now, why do I say that? Whenever developers are building something or building a piece of code, and it depends on the organization. If you're a massive organization, you'll have lots of silos, but mostly if you're in smaller companies or even mid-sized companies, you'll have to end up putting your system, your program, on some Windows or Linux box. You're going to have to put it on the device it's going to be running on. You're going to have to get it building and probably build a bit of a CI/CD system to get it going if that's the size of your organization. So there's usually more of a interaction between developers and their skills and the operations teams. You know, in the bookcase behind me, I've got a couple of books back from my development days that are more about cloud or more about Linux operating systems than they are programming, because that's just something you had to do to get things going. I have changed parts of Linux in the past to get DNS things working, etc. So it's really interesting that, and we'll talk about this later on, whenever DevOps came around and it was suddenly that developers and operations had to come together and do that, that's a slightly easier fit because it was already something that a lot of developers were already doing. But when it comes to security, again, as I mentioned before, it can sometimes be something they don't have even visibility of, or it's not a part of something that comes up in the conversation. But security, well, we always hear these stories about how security doesn't work with it. It's seen as a blocker. Some companies will push security more than others, etc. It's really interesting in terms of the industry. And again, I'm going to guess and make an assumption, happy to debate it, that most of the people in this this meetup have some relation to a software company that takes security seriously, probably because they have to, probably because they're in an industry vertical like finance, like healthcare, retail, etc., where the security question's coming up. But what we got to also remember is there's a whole other area of the world of software development, of companies, of verticals that are not dealing with security. You know, I sometimes talk to companies from other industries, and it's just, yep, security is not a challenge for us. Security is not something we need to solve. It's obviously, we know it's a problem. We see the breaches, we see the sort of conversations, but in terms of our day-to-day work, it's not something that's going to come up. We're not in the market for that. So we got to remember that there is that whole other area of the world. Now, why do I mention that if we're at a security meetup? Is because those developers and the people involved in agile and management, etc., you know, they're going to move around industries. They're going to come into companies that are in a vertical that do have an interest in it, and vice versa. People in sort of in financial companies right now have to deal with the security, but maybe move over there. So it's an interesting mix going around the sort of the industry of people with and without security expertise. Now, education's so important there to make sure they're able to bring it up, but we'll talk more about that later on. In terms of development experience with tooling, this is an interesting one. I don't think it comes up that much. Usually, as a developer, they will see themselves as having a tool for a job. So if I want to have somewhere where I'm going to put my code, I go to GitHub, I go to GitLab, I go to Bitbucket. If I'm going to have something that's going to do my tickets, I've got Jira, I've got ServiceNow, whatever that may be. If I'm going to do CI/CD, I get a vendor platform in or whatever, and I do that. But it's one platform that's going to do these various things, and that's the mindset that then comes along. Now, you then have the likes of GitHub, GitLab, Atlassian, etc., who are bringing in more of a whole solution, where GitHub is going to hold your repositories, is going to host your artifacts, is going to do your CI/CD and hook you in with all the things. Azure DevOps is a lot more along that line, where you can pretty much keep everything within Azure in one way or another from start to finish. So it's interesting developers see that sort of mindset come about, and obviously those large vendors are focusing on that and trying to push that along to the development industry. Now, security, as we'll get to later on, completely breaks that, because it's not one tool for one job. It's suddenly, here's 100 different tools that are going to do 100 different things in 100 different ways, and You can see why security sometimes has a jerking reaction whenever they're used to this. GitHub does this, you know, Circle CI does this, and over here suddenly it's all disjointed and it's all a bit of a mess. The drives and pressures, getting stuff done. It's about focus, it's about clarity, it's about making sure that they have a backlog of issues that is prioritized. That's the currency they deal with in their sprint meetings. That's where they decide what they're going to work on, what they're going to fix. Security, especially in terms of DevSecOps, where suddenly you have bunches of tools throwing in hundreds of issues, of which, you know, mixes in false positives and lack of priorities, and every SQL injection is a critical, even though it's not on a critical system, etc. That doesn't jar well at all with development experiences. You know, they want a lot more clarification there. They want the new issues. They don't want to have the same 500 issues brought from the same 5-10 tools every time they do a bloody build. They want to know, has anything changed? Has anything new come up that I need to fix? Have I broken anything new? And in terms of security communication, this comes back to the lots of different tools, but also lots of different areas in terms of security. Developers, I've never seen developers being too resistant to learning something new, and they're usually very good at bringing it on board, but it's whether it's relevant to them or not. I do remember in my past, I've sat on 2 separate 5-day Oracle training courses, and I don't think I ever ended up having to work with an Oracle database. So it's a complete bloody waste of time. It was a jolly, there was nice scones, it was a nice trip away, but I never got anything career-wise out of it. Now, developers, whenever they're having to learn about security things, as we know, there's OWASP top 10, SANS top 25, there's hundreds of issues out there, hundreds of types of controls out there that you would need to learn. And trying to bring all that in and sort of bring somebody up to speed on something that then allows them to be effective in their job is kind of a hard thing to bring them in. They'll do their compliance, but sometimes it's best to actually let them know about the security issues whenever they come up, rather than, I'm going to generally teach you about SQL injections here, even though you may never work with a database. You know, it's really about, they have a hard time understanding that. So just a point here that we're going to discuss, and again, happy for anybody to jump in, or I can check the what do you call the chat. But as I mentioned, the DevOps was a lot more natural progression, because developers already had to work with operations stuff, and operations people, basically with the likes of Puppet and Chef, etc., that was becoming more code, or infrastructure as code, so it was merging anyway. And CI/CD and stuff like that, they're brought along the glue and all sorts of stuff, but it really was an easier mindset. Security just isn't there yet. Security is not something that they have to deal with day in, day out. So therefore, as an industry, if you take the whole 100% of software developers around the world in companies and industries that care about security, and the majority that doesn't, then the discipline of software development is not going to naturally go towards security. Every software company has to have operations. They don't have to have security. So it's a lot easier fit. So what we find is, you'll find your security champions and your people who are interested in it, who will get into security. But there's an interesting angle there, in that they're moving into security to be more of a then lateral move. They've probably taken that semi or conscious decision to move into security, to move into the security realm. They probably know they're moving slightly outside of development at that time, because the career progression might bring them into the security team rather than moving them up in the development team. It's interesting to see how that works. So there's more job prospects for other skills rather than security. So I'm just having a couple of questions come up, so let me just see if I can try and get into those. Just-in-time learning, is it a thing? Yeah, it's a really good question. You know, how do you do just-in-time learning? They've got the likes of Checkmarks, etc., and other ones that do the code bashing and those types of things. You know, how do you do it? How do you make sure that developers, whenever some issue comes up, like command injection, suddenly then are able to understand what command injection is and how to fix it, and even more specifically, how this certain company fixes it? It is a challenge, and it's something that you have to work out in your organization, or as a as a system how you're going to do that. Do you give everybody this sort of the standard platform, let them understand here's how issues are, and then whenever those types of issues come up, is there something you can produce? Is there a documentation site you have, or is there training courses from the likes of Secure Code Warrior or whatever that's going to be, where you can then say, look, this has come up, let's bring you up to speed on that there. Here's a 15-minute or an hour-long training course that's going to bring you up to speed in that specific issue, rather than something that's going to generically cover lots of different things. And then measure that, see if that helps or not. Now, there's different platforms of different ways of bringing that just-in-time learning to the developers as they're happening. Our platform does it, but again, it's just in the platform presentation. But there's some way that you can educate people on the fly. That's going to be a lot more relevant to them, because the developer, whenever you are dinged in a code review, or whenever something goes wrong from a performance point of view, whatever, in your code, that's when you've got the incentive, the energy to learn about how something is, and to do the learning around that, rather than something generic. So, sorry, just going back over this here. For companies who don't care about security, is that more of an excuse, or can this be genuine opposition? I don't see it as opposition. I see it as genuinely not a factor for them. As I know of companies who have developed software for years, and it wasn't until some client has then asked for a security report or a penetration test or whatever, that then it becomes a thing that they have to do. And even then, it is a compliance thing to get ticked off, bring in somebody who's going to do a bit of a penetration test and get things done. I know of financial organizations who have a pen test which looks very, very strangely like the output of Burp Suite being run, through a proxy, and it's not even authenticated, and that's their penetration test. So it's a tick box to how do I get this seal, how do I get this thing going in, rather than any opposition, rather than, oh my God, we hate security, we don't want to be involved. It's just like certain startups won't be caring yet about scalability or performance because they're at the early stages of getting a product going. It's not that they don't care about it, it's not that they're absolutely adverse to it, it's that it's just not the factor they have to work on right now. So if you're working in an organization, and retail probably had a lot of this in the past, where security maybe wasn't the biggest problem because it was getting things done, it was getting the system updated before Christmas so that they can be in front ahead of their competitors. It's not opposition, it's just not part of the conversation. As I say, I remember being in a company where I was flagging up security problems. There was a particular potential problem where just by going to a URL, people would be charged for a certain thing, and it just wasn't ever going to be a factor. I can mention that because it's 15 years ago, so it's not really much of a problem. But yeah, it's not an opposition, it's just not part of the conversation. And again, we, in this particular meetup echo chamber, maybe don't see that as much because we're driven and incentivized by companies who are rewarding us to know more about security. So security is risk perception. Some accept it, some don't. Yeah, and that's a much wider question, but it's very, very true. I used to do presentations where I brought along a lockbox, which was about $5, and I said, look, if this lockbox secured a chocolate bar, which was 30p, I was wasting money. If you spend more on security than you do in terms of the business value, you're going to go out of business. That just doesn't make sense. So it's all about your risk perceptions. And even when you get into the banking world, I've worked for one of the largest banks in the world. It is all about risk perception. It's all about dealing with the biggest risks and dealing with what you can, rather than stopping everything and just trying to get all your issues down. It is something I find interesting in the world of DevSecOps, and not to talk about any particular vendor or system, but there are some, how would I say, blueprints or systems that wrap in various tools into CI/CD, but the way they work is they will feel the CI/CD build on the existence of any issue. And I think, as many of us know, if anybody's been a penetration tester or worked in security, there's never zero security issues, just like there's never zero bugs or tickets or features. There was a survey done earlier this year that mentioned about 81% of developers knowingly release software with security bugs in it, and that's probably higher, and that's probably, fine's the wrong word, but every software system is lightly released with certain known issues in there. Some of those will be security. Now, if 81% of developers are releasing software with known very exploitable, high critical bugs that's got access to billions of records with passports, etc., that's a big bloody issue. But if it's you haven't put in certain header in some simple program that's internal and nobody cares about, that's probably fine. That's part of your risk. So there's an interesting angle there about how developers are having to do that. Who or what should reward for the dev for taking interest in security? Team leads or business? Yeah, it's a really good question, Stephen. I don't know the answer to that. I'd love a debate on that. Who should, or the reward? I've heard the reward question come up a number of times, and I've seen the debate. Usually it's left to security. Usually you'll have your security champions, as I say. I've never seen a program in an organization, and I know some people on this meetup have a lot of consulting experience with organizations, so I'd love to jump in here, but I've never seen a really good reward program that's tied to the security champion bit, so that actually causes promotions or bonuses based on security aspects whenever you're not working in security. Has anybody else seen that? Just to ask. I'll go on to the next question, but if anybody has seen a reward system there that's for the security aspects or security champions, would be really interested to know.
Okay, I thought I'd come up and say,
please.
So the question I ask is that should this be an intrinsic value, i.e., the extrinsic motivator, which is rewards and stuff like that? If we've got it right, should we not have a system where we are motivated by intrinsic values? I want to do this because I want my code to be secure, and I want to do it the right way, rather than actually being rewarded from it as an external factor.
But so for some people, and it's an interesting debate. I one of my views on that there is, for some people it is like a Donald Rumsfeld unknown unknowns. It's like, that everybody's had those scenarios where you're in a conversation or you're in a scenario and suddenly you realize you got completely the wrong end of the stick, or you didn't know something had happened, or you put your foot in it, whatever, and you're thinking, oh gosh, I didn't know that, I shouldn't have said that, or whatever. For some people, yeah, there could be an intrinsic thing where it would be lovely for them to get into security, but if it's just not something they know about, then it's not, how does it even become part of the, Jungian collective unconsciousness of security, for them to know, oh my gosh, right, there is a lot of things here that I need to deal with. I might go off and learn about that. OWASP, to both bum up and also bum down OWASP. The OWASP top 10 is loved by a lot of people. Most people in OWASP hate the OWASP top 10. It was a marketing trick to get, oh, here's a top 10, here's some things we'd be interested in. It's not a security list. It's not even, they're not even sure if it's a list of issues or risks or what the hell it is. It's just a list of 10 things. And then we have lots of vendors and we have lots of people. And I've seen organizations, again in finance, that have posters of the OWASP top 10 on their walls as a way of saying, this is our way of making sure everybody knows about security. Now, it's a brilliant start and it's a definite move in that direction. But you take something like the OWASP ASVS standard, that's like 300 different issues, and that's not even anywhere near a comprehensive list of going into infrastructure or cloud or containers or other things like that. So that it's a really, almost the question is, if the premise before people being intrinsically rewarded for doing security is them being aware security is even a thing and what quote unquote security is. Like, is that fair, or am I being sort of downtrodden on the development community and thinking that it's, that there's not enough knowledge there? I do remember I got in trouble with a university before. I was doing a presentation and I gave out that the university never taught me any security in my university times, and somebody from the university was in the audience and gave out to me in the presentation saying, we cover both aspects of security. I said, what do you mean? He says, we cover like SQL injections and XSS. I said, well, by saying that, you're again showing you've gone technical and you've missed the other 500, 600 types of controls that you're not teaching about. So it's a tough one for people to get involved with. Yeah, please, if anybody wants to jump on, please do, please do. OWASP Top 10 2020 seems to clarify that point as to what the top 10 is. Yeah, absolutely. And I actually really like the top 10 2021 because it also gets away from pure technical controls. The last one, gosh, so 2017, it had a really interesting one where number 10 of the OWASP top 10 was essentially, do you have the right log messages and security events and all that sort of stuff? And I found that really funny because you still had all the vendors and all lots of people saying, "Oh, we as a dynamic application security tool cover the OWASP top 10." And I'm like, how does a dynamic security tool check your security events and your logs in the back end? Sure, that's not even a thing. So OWASP top 10 2021 is getting more towards it being a process rather than just a group of technical controls. You're very right. I've heard people pulling security requirements from NFRs into key business requirements instead. If we move security requirements into the CI/CD build process to automatically test developers, is that a workable solution? So obviously that's our area, and it's an area I'm very involved with. It's part of the solution, but it's not the entire solution at all. So putting automated test tools into CI/CD will give you the coverage that will give you automated natures of the coverage that a penetration test would do. A subset of those. Sorry. So instead of the penetration tester every 6 months running XYZ tool or those group of tools, etc., as well as doing manual checks, what you're saying is, well, our organization is agile. We're DevOps. We ain't releasing every 6 months. So how do we provide some level of assurance in our daily or weekly builds? Putting in those security checks allows you to do that. Now, interestingly, as well as that, we've done some analysis on things like OWASP, ASVS, and NIST, etc. And around about half of the automatable controls probably aren't checked by off-the-shelf security tools. There's something that's quite specific to the organization, how authentication's done, or business logic, or that sort of stuff. So there's more of a program needed around there. But as you know, to give Glenn credit in his book, it's about the education, it's about the secure by design, and it's about the automation. It's about bringing lots of different things together that's going to provide those different things. Now, where are your easy wins? Might be automation, might be education. Definitely, as an organization, you pick off the easiest ways to move things forward. But know one thing: education isn't a complete solution. Moving everything left isn't a complete solution. Automation isn't a complete solution. But working together, you're going to be able to bring those things together and make life a lot easier. Or does security just become a blocker? Yes. Yes, security, especially in CI/CD, can be done very, very, very wrong. We've talked to organizations who suddenly stuck in a couple of tools because, again, DevSecOps the term, lots of vendors jumped on board and said, yes, I've got an API, so therefore I am DevSecOps, and that is both true and both not true. So we've talked to organizations that stuck in an API and then suddenly had something off on the side, which was nice, very pretty, very expensive, and was collecting lots of issues, but nobody was going near it. Nobody looked at it, so it's hard to do that. And then there's other people who do bring lots of tools in and have those tools feed back into the CI/CD process. But then, as I mentioned, if they're throwing back 500 issues, 300 of which are false positives, and they're saying we're only going to pass the build if there's 0 issues, that gets bypassed very, very quickly. So surely it was on the cryptography and network security back in the day. Sorry, I'm not sure if I get that. MK, if you want to ask that again, apologies. Sorry, maybe I'm missing a part of that conversation. Love triangle between Bob, Alice, and Eve. Very good. Okay, so I'm going to move on. Again, if there's any questions or anybody wants to jump on stage, please do so. Again, we've got a couple of contenders right now for the books in terms of questions being asked, but if anybody wants to jump on stage, you can put yourself definitely in front. I'll move forward. I also very conscious of the time here. I know it's 6:05. I'll plan to do another 5-10 minutes. Please let me know, Glenn, Michael, if that's the right way to go or whatever. We've got the bunches of slides. We're not getting through them all. Again, this is good to get this sort of debate going. And it's not all about my opinions. If anybody has any suggestions or if anybody wants to get on and just plain argue with me, that's great. That's success. So we can do it that way. Operations team, again, down to their, well, let me summarize this. I did operations with never having an operations role. I brought in Jenkins into organizations back just after it was Hudson, brought in CI/CD, brought in lots of cloud stuff, but it's something that developers got into a lot more, and I've already mentioned that development and operations are a bit more closely aligned. Operations teams usually are focused on the vendor environment, so you're an AWS expert, you're a Circle CI expert, or usually when you get more mature and more experience, you're able to go across lots of different vendors, but that's usually the way we see sometimes these job specs push out. You know, they're asking for people who are on specific technologies, not just somebody who knows CI/CD. Culture and impress is usually getting, you know, tickets or not tickets, sorry, badges, whatever, on these various tools that and vendor products that come out. To move into, so we're with development, yep, they're seeing more of their interaction being done in code. So infrastructure is code and code and code lines. With security, usually again seen as a bit of a blocker. They have sometimes, and we've seen this here when security is being brought into CI/CD, especially the security tools. If you've got 100 lines of Python or whatever it is to get your tool to work, and then you wrap that into the DevOps guys and say, here's what we need to do, and they say, oh crap, I've got to give this to 100 different teams. That doesn't go down too well. And then you do the second tool and the third tool, and suddenly majority of the CI/CD logic is actually just messed up with all this security tool logic. That doesn't go down well with the security people. You know, their drives, their pressures is, as I say here, they're the grease that makes the whole software development flow from code to release. So putting in things is going to make that harder to do at speed, do at scale, but also put in a bit more maintenance and things breaking. That's not going to go down too well. Kind of mentioned that here, yeah. So, one thing that does come up a lot, especially from developers and CI/CD people, is this middle bullet point is the lack of consistency among security tools. Now, YAML's not exactly consistent either, which is usually the language that the CI/CD systems are working in. If you're working in ADO or GitHub or Circle CI, the YAML will be slightly different, but it's pretty much the same. If you think about security, as I've already mentioned before, developers and operations have a certain tool that's going to hold the code, hold the repos, hold the artifacts, it's going to do the CI/CD and blah, blah, blah. And then along comes security, and we say, well, you need these tools to do the static scanning, you need these other tools to do the source code analysis, software composition analysis, you need this thing for container, you need this thing to check AWS, you need these things to do dynamic tests, etc. And by the way, none of them work in the same way. They're all going to be kicked off differently. There's no single reporting mechanism. Some of them are going to find the same issues, but they're going to report them in different ways and with different priorities, etc. It just isn't a mindset that meshes, and it just gets people literally pissed off, saying, well, why the hell am I going to do this here? Why the hell am I going to have to bring in all these different tools? Give me one tool to do everything, and then they just realize that doesn't work. And it's not security's fault, not security vendor's fault. You know, if you're a SaaS tool or a DaaS tool or a cloud tool, you're checking certain specific things. It's just unfortunately part of the nature, technically, of security, that there's just so many different types of controls that you need to check for that you are going to have to need that patchwork quilt Venn diagram overlap of various tools to be able to do that. But rising the level above the technicality, you have to be able to make sure it all goes into Jira or ServiceNow. You got to report in the same way. You got to make sure the developers are able to see just what's new instead of the 500 issues that were before. You got to make it easier for them to work with rather than jarring against them. And that's even if the tools work in the same way. Again, we see companies that have issues where they're changing code lines. So maybe a certain project with the CI/CD had a repo of X before, now they've changed to a different branch or whatever that's going to be. Well, the security product over here, which was set up independently, and somebody in security or somebody, you know, from development once off, went in and configured, here's the repo we use. But suddenly security checking the completely different thing than what's actually being used in the project. So they all, you know, the CI/CD is really becoming the place of truth for a lot of the development events, the code lines, the containers that are used, the staging environment that it's been deployed on and tested against. That's where the truth is. And security tools need to be working with those rather than set up independently. And, you know, if somebody has to change the repo or change the place where the system's running. They don't need to go to 15 different tools to update that config. That's not going to go down very well at all. So does security even have the skills and tech as the tech changes, let alone the dev? Does security even have the skills as the tech changes, let alone the dev or ops teams? So when you talk about the tech changes, you mean as different code lines come in, or different languages or framework, etc., Steve? We've definitely, you see that in organizations that are large and are buying in other companies, where the security setup they have right now maybe is tied in and around one vendor, and essentially their security processes are wrapped around one product. And then whenever some other company is bought that develops in C# now instead of Python or whatever, this now doesn't work, because we're going to have to bring something else in, or our tool doesn't do it, or that's a bit of an issue. So that I've seen that sort of problem before, if that's what you're meaning. Joe, great. I really appreciate you saying totally disagree with our idea of ops. I really appreciate chatting about that afterwards. If that's okay with you, Joe, I would really be interested in your input. Yeah, the tech changes so quickly, it's often hard to work out what good security looks like and which tools to choose. That's something we've been working with a lot actually in the past while. There's so many companies, whenever they approach the tools, it sometimes comes down to, well, what's my favorite tool, or what was I taught to use, or whatever. You know, some of the vendor tools, you can go on a 5-day training course to learn how to use it. You know, that's how difficult it can be sometimes, but also how much invested people can get into it. But it's really interesting in that the tools become a black box. I'm going to run a tool, I'm going to get some results back, I'm going to fix those 15 or whatever issues, and then I'm going to consider that security is quote unquote done. You know, we are now secure. But the step you got to take back there is saying, right, well, if I'm going to run this tool, what controls does that tool actually check for? And again, we can share some things. We've done some research in that there. Again, using OWASP, ASVS as a starting point. If you take something like, imagine taking OWASP ASVS as a spreadsheet, and it's got about 300 controls, as I say. We've added a lot more to the bottom. If you go to a tool and say, right, what actual controls does this tool say it's going to check for? And a lot of the open source tools, as well as some of the commercial tools, especially if you've paid the money, you'll get the list. You can see what controls they actually check for. Now, then you take the assumption that they actually do find those in every scenario, etc. But you can start to see where those controls are covered and where you don't. And that's a really interesting conversation some people have, where they say, right, well, if I take the controls that are 100% of the controls that are there, even if you narrow down the controls you're interested in, like SQL injection or whatever it might be for your certain organization, that's the way to take the tools and map them in and say, right, well, I want to make sure I have these tools in my automation, and then also know where I don't have controls or don't have coverage, because that's what my penetration test or my code reviews or whatever I'm going to do is going to have that coverage as well. And then the layer, almost the 3D layer to that is saying, well, what do they do in the languages we care about? And again, I'm not going to mention vendors, but I have seen vendors running perfectly, really well against one language. Usually the older languages, C#, Java, that sort of stuff. But whenever you give it something like Ruby, they don't tend to find the issues, because we have done manual checks, manual code reviews, found bug obvious SQL injections that were not found by a vendor, even though they'll find it easily in C# or Java, not found in that other language. So it's a real hard question, and it actually comes down to just sucking it and trying it, getting the systems, getting the tools, seeing what it works, seeing what it finds, seeing what happens over time, and then just making that easier to work with. So guys, I'm really conscious actually that I've been talking a wee bit longer than I meant to. I'm going to take your lead. Do you want me to stop presenting now and go back into the bubbles, or do you want to keep going through the questions? How would you guys like me to continue?
So Gary, there's no time limit. If everyone's happy for Gary to carry on presenting and asking the questions, answering the questions, I should say, then we're more than happy to do that. So I mean, there's no hurry to join the bubbles. If people have got questions, if you've got a burning desire to come up and talk to Gary or put your point across, then please do so, like we are doing now.
Please, yeah.
That's what we do in the live world. So please, Say something,
Magno,
Jim.
I love your question, by the way, Magno. Do security engineers need to be able to code in the DevSecOps era? So if I'm going to try and become controversial, I'll say that in general, security engineers do not know how to write software. Now, that might jar, might not. Now, and what I mean by that is that being a software developer is a lot more than just being able to write code. It's about being able to debug. It's about being able to do the agile process. It's about being able to work with teams. It's about being able to, get that level into programming where you become an expert at it. Writing a couple of scripts, doing something in Python for 20 lines is glue, is getting things working together, but it does not make you a programmer. And I have seen projects in the past, both by software development teams and by security teams and by QA teams, funnily enough, where they have tried to develop something extensive and it has failed, not because of the code, but because of the software development process around it failed. So it's a really interesting thing there. And in my experience, a lot of software developers, a lot of security people don't have coding ability really. We developed the secure coding guidelines or secure code review document for OWASP. That was geared at developers, educating them in how to bring security checks that they know about, that they're experienced in, into their software development code review. I would put it to you that if you got a lot of software security people and put them into general code reviews, they wouldn't understand enough of the intrinsics of the language to be able to understand things. Yeah, you'll find a very basic, simple SQL injection, but there's automated tools can do that. What value is being added there would be a good question. So I would say they not code with CAN-script. Yeah, absolutely. Maybe security just need to go back and learn the basics. Does X affect C and I? Yeah, that's where they can add value. The tools can do that there, but that's, if you're going to do anything, that's where they could add value. And how do you do that as a company is hard, because how do you sort out where security should get involved and where they shouldn't? Obviously, if somebody's making a change to their authentication mechanism in a project, security should probably get involved. What value do they add there, and how often does that happen? It's an interesting one. The skill of debugging and incident forensics are close cousins. Isn't this something that devs and security can learn a lot from each other? I definitely think that's very true, Chris. I think that's very true. I think the developers can learn a lot about that, and the security people on the other side can, learn more probably from the design or threat models, that sort of stuff, rather than looking at the code. Is probably a way you could put that. But again, that's just my opinion. Happy to be wrong. How do you bring in the management team to give dev time to actually run the tools and dive in? That's a really good question, Francisco. That's a really good question, and I have never seen a proper answer to that, because the time is so tight. So yeah, and what tools do they learn, and do you learn one tool? Yeah, I've seen people can be given the time. What I usually see, actually, and again, I'd be interested to see if this is other people's experience. There's usually a team in a company that's into security, and it's really funny because I've mentioned that in sales calls with conversations with clients, and there's usually a laugh, and they say, "Yeah, I know exactly the team." So it seems to be a thing that there's usually some team in some company that will be interested in security, and that's where you can get them to learn the tools and stuff, etc. But it's one of the things of shift left. If the developers are going to be having to learn how to run the tools, that doesn't work. So developers, obviously, developers are, all these people we're talking about here, they're all technically ability. We're not saying anybody doesn't have the skills or doesn't have the implicit skills to do it. It's about what time do they have to do to learn something and do their job and do their J job and not get fired for doing things that are outside of their own remit. So developers can run tools. Normally they'll get pissed off at how long it takes to learn to use a certain tool. Like I love OWASP, it's great, but trying to get that working over the API with an external system is more trouble than it should be. So that's something that we can make easier in terms of an organization or an industry. But the other problem you run into there is system of record, because most regulations, which even in financial and retail, etc., that's still the main driver, it's still the main tick box that people are trying to do security for. Those regulations both require risk analysis rather than just technical, but they also require separation of duty and a system of record. So what they expect, they essentially say, whoever does the coding should be separate from whoever does the security, and there should be records and proof that security was applied and here's what was done. Now, if you're saying to the security person or the developer, not only now, legally bound to run this security tool, welcome to your world, that's what you're going to be doing, you also have to keep a record of it and have some way of recording with the things. And also, by the way, the regulations don't allow you to do that because it has to be somebody separate. It causes a bit of confusion, which is really interesting. Sorry, there's lots of questions coming through, apologies. From security people and sec can be consumed by developer engineers, okay. Suppose that the root cause of application issues is usually related to code. We assume that developers don't learn security. How do we fix this from the start? Is it just adding AppSec topics to dev college degrees? I think actually Glenn might be a good person to, oh, sorry, you said, yeah, 100%. I think bringing awareness into that there is quite good. I think you'll never get everything. Look, I'm a board member of OWASP. I've been a penetration tester, a security consultant. I've been a developer. I still love it whenever I find blogs on some technical issue that I just wasn't fully aware of or see a new way of doing it. So there's no way that could ever be 100%. There's always going to be those gaps. It's about maybe how do we work out the best way to cover some of that education? How do we those things that the gamification sessions, they're really good for getting people interested in if they get the time. There's lots of things there. Is it a skill set thing? Isn't DevSecOps about collaboration between expertise and not individuals to do a DevSecOps? Yeah, that's part of what we're talking about here. Again, we're not trying to lambast anybody. We're trying to talk about some of the problems why security just doesn't naturally go over to developers, why security obviously can't scale, and why operations are more interested in getting things going faster than secure. So we're trying to discuss some of the culture things here rather than saying there's any solution. And you're very right. If people are skilled and they can collaborate, and there's ways people can collaborate in a way that gets the culture going, because you can stick in the tech, but the culture really has to work there as well. As I say, if you have it not breaking the builds every time there's an issue, not throwing back hundreds of issues, but also educating the developers whenever there are issues, that's a really interesting way to work together. Okay. So there's no more questions, and I'm going to take the safe assumption you guys are very tired of me rambling up here on the presentation slide. I think, is this a good chance to move back to the bubble?
Gary.
Oh, hi, Michael.
Hi, Ian. Okay, thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you for coming up and asking the question or arguing with me. I hope it's a good argument. Hi, Michael.
Something when it came from, I guess the question was just around, like, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now, yes.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to jump in with someone's question when it came to, like, how do we like educate around information security. And I mean, I guess I'm only jumping in because I'm still like I'm like in my final year of my degree at the moment. And I've had like maybe 80% of coding related modules, and probably only had like one information security module itself. And not that I'm kind of coming up here just to like say what all the problems are with the degree program. I think it's an amazing degree that I'm on right now. But I guess something that I've just noticed is, even in kind of like the security element of things, I feel like we only ever focus on the code itself, and there's kind of like very little demand on, when it comes to like the actual, I'm just going to call it infrastructure right now, for lack of better phrases, but what I mean is like the methodology. So when we learn about Agile, we don't really learn about the coding elements of Agile. We more learn about, how do we organize our groups into different like kind of like structures essentially, and then how do we like select the timeline. But if I was to just like throw it out there, like what should we talk about in security? I mean, we're going to go for like cryptography. We're going to go through decrypting, encrypting. We'll look at like let's look at, you know, a 5-line Python script, how to encrypt and decrypt. But then I feel like there's kind of like just very little emphasis on, you know, let's say, for example, we take the OWASP top 10, for example, like how much emphasis is there on, you know, maybe like the methodology and the process of how people, you know, break into a bank, for example. There's more like, I guess there's more focus on, let's, you know, maybe we can blame Hollywood because all we ever see is the, you know, the coders and, you know, hoods up, you know, typing away. We never really see, you know, the planning, you know, the blueprint, the, you know, X, Y, and Z. So I feel like, yeah, I definitely agree with, I can't remember who posed that question, but I definitely agree that there's not a lot of, I feel like there is kind of like education around it, but I just feel like the education, just to like sum up what I'm saying, I just feel like the education around it is more focused on the development side of things as opposed to maybe the operation side of things, for example. I don't know how much you agree or disagree with that.
I think that's really interesting. And one question I had for you, Michael, is it's really interesting that as a university student, you're at a session like this. Is that, are you doing this with the interest of learning more about security as well, learning more about the operations? Is that part of your drive for being here?
Yeah, definitely. So like I kind of have to mention I've been like incredibly nervous, just kind of like even just trying to jump up essentially. But I've kind of realized that thank you. I've kind of realized that yeah, I just need to kind of like just throw myself out there essentially. You know, however much of, you know, that imposter syndrome that you get from it, just throw yourself out there.
Yeah.
I'm sure. I think I listened to like a TED talk where, you know, they just kind of discuss that if I'm feeling imposter syndrome, then chances are somebody else is feeling the same way as well. But yeah, like, yeah, the reason for being here was, for me, was just to like kind of put myself in the environment, speak to people who have like 10 times the experience that I have, and just hopefully learn from just learn from the community essentially.
And to ask you a question, in your university course, you mentioned that there was a module on security. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
First of all, that's great that there is a module. I know in my day there definitely wasn't, but how many people would have, what percentage of your class or would have been interested in doing that there? Was it a popular one or not? And or in just a general of your peers in the university, is security something that they are aware of that's mentioned, or is it a lot more focused on just other development areas of software development?
I mean, it will be very difficult for me to like start throwing out numbers just because I haven't actually done a survey. And I don't really want to like, I don't want people to use the numbers that I give now to be like, you know, this is what's happening in, you know, X university. But I think it's very difficult, not unless you have like a passion for like security, for example. I think it is something that is quite difficult to kind of like, you know, do a module and be like, yeah, I'm interested in security. So the numbers were quite low. I feel like I'm maybe like one of maybe, let me just say I'm the only one who kind of like wants to go down this pathway. I'm sorry, I have to ask you what your second question is, because as I rambled, I think
No, it's just really trying to understand from your point of view, was, you know, what was the security module something that everybody flocked to, and whenever you're with your compatriots, you know, do they talk about security and that's something do they even know what OWASP is, or is it not something you find as much of a factor in their day-to-day thought process?
Yeah, I would definitely go down that element in terms of like not really much of a focus. I think probably just like more to my point before, where it's like I feel like there's a focus around just the buzzwords in security. I feel like there's just a focus around like because security sounds cool in terms of like it's cool to watch. I can't remember what show it was the other day. With the villain from James Bond. He was in a series. I think Mr. Robot, that was it.
Mr. Robot, yeah.
You forget that. And so it's really cool to like watch Mr. Robot and just watch all of the cool things he does, for example. Or it's really cool to like, you know, jump online, find a quick vulnerability, and you know, you've downloaded a code from like, you know, a malicious site, and then being able to run it on your friends, for example. But you know, where I'm talking about like a genuine interest in like, how do we actually build I don't really want to say build a community, but how do we actually like, kind of more to my point previously, was like, how do we actually not worry too much about the code? Because in my opinion, I feel like the code is really easy to write as long as you understand what you're writing. For example, like you can write it in like 100 different languages. But yeah, just to sum up, not as much of a like a, you know, not as much of an interest as you would hope for.
No, but thank you so much for speaking up about there, and that's it's interesting to see that's, you know, I think generally there's like Glenn, you mentioned in your book, there's a 1-to-100 sort of ratio between security and development, and that's usually the way it goes. It's it is probably going to be the same way, I guess, going into the future and then the future generations. So we have to work out other ways of doing this here. Education is obviously very important, but I think just, you know, I don't know if we have the answer. If we had the answer in this meetup, that would be a really good result. I think that'd be brilliant.
I know about Prime as well. Thank you so much, Michael, for coming up and asking some really good questions and sharing your experience and story with us. I think actually that's worthy of a book.